Welcome everyone, and thanks again for joining us for our live session on Zero Trust, Evolving Your Security Posture for Public Cloud. My name is Ilja Markowski. I'm the Regional Director for HashiCorp Australia New Zealand, and I'll be your host today. We have a great session lined up for you today with our guest speakers, Grant Orchard, Field CTO, Asia Pacific and Japan, and Talha Tariq, HashiCorp's very own Vice President and Chief Security Officer, who will be discussing how Zero Trust is evolving as a concept while sharing some practical considerations you can look to minimize your risk of a breach in this fast-moving world of cybersecurity. You'll hear about how HashiCorp approaches Zero Trust for our own users and systems, how it fits into our product development, and when building and running our own cloud services. Now, we want to keep this session interactive, so please post your questions in the chat tab during the session, and we'll weave them somehow into the conversations. So if you click on all panelists and attendees, so we can ensure that those questions are read by everyone. So before we get started, I wanted to note that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be made available within the next day or two. We'll send you an email with links to the recording as well, so you can share those with others. Remember to submit your questions through the sessions via the chat tab, and we'll answer them as we go. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Over to you, Grant.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for the intro, Ilch. And yeah, allow me to add my welcomes for everybody, especially Talha, joining us from the US today. So to kick things off, Talha, I thought it might be nice just to explore a little bit about what you do. Clearly, as a company, HashiCorp, we have our open source offerings, we have commercial offerings of that self-same software, we have cloud offerings, and then also, we're made up of our own internal teams and users who consume software from other vendors. So maybe just, how you fit into that sort of, range of sort of personas would be awesome.
Right. Thank you, Grant, and thank you, Ilch, and welcome all the attendees from APJ. This is my first time talking to our prospects and customers in that market, so very excited to be here. Quick background, I joined HashiCorp about 2 years ago. My role, I'm responsible for all things security, privacy, and compliance and operations in the company. What I do day to day is I also most of my time is spent on helping build our program, scaling up our security program. I also spend quite a bit of time talking to our customers in helping shaping up our security posture and security journey, including security features of our products. So it's a fun role that I have here. I tend to be the implementer of all the Zero Trust solutions that we make. So I help my marketing team and my product team in helping think through the right positioning and phasing and strategy of these things as well. So most of my time is mostly spent on internal facing security operations, security capabilities of our program. Some time is spent on influencing our products. Rest of the time is spent talking to our customers and prospects.
Yeah, nice. Great. All right, so with that, probably like to lead in a little bit to the question and the theme of today's session, which is really for us to explore a bit around how public cloud has impacted the way that we think about Zero Trust. And I'm going to air quote Zero Trust because it is a fairly short term that contains so much. And if we look back to when Zero Trust was first used, I think it was sort of circa 2009, 2010. Our security focus was very much in the data center. We had users that were all operating in an office. So a question in two parts, if that's all right. First of all, I'd love to get a layman's definition from you around Zero Trust that's a little bit more expansive than just a couple of words. And secondly, how the rise of public cloud, which has really exploded probably more in the last, I guess, 5 years, and whether Zero Trust has sort of managed to evolve or, how it's weathered that uprising.
Great question. So I think my perspective, and Zero Trust is a pretty overloaded term and means different things to different people. Also different vendors try to position different types of Zero Trust security and philosophies. My view, I'll share just a slide to help walk through at least high level my take on zero trust. I think it boils down to three things. The first one is it's not one binary thing. It's a set of design principles. It's a set of coordinated strategy and a system management strategy on how do you think about trust in your environment, whether it touches your applications, your data center, your network, your users, how these entities interact with each other. You also acknowledge that your perimeter-based security is all of those notions don't scale up with the notions of cloud, that threats exist both inside and outside of your traditional network boundaries. And I'll allude to what that means a little bit later, but historically, as we see the transition from on-prem to cloud, you'll see in the perimeter side of the business, a lot of security is focused on what we call the castle in the moat, like everything inside the data center is trusted, everything outside the data center is not trusted. You tend to put your security controls on your choke and the core egress ingress points like firewalls and networking gear and SIM and WAF and what have you. I think the third piece, which is the most critical, is the zero trust model. It just eliminates trusting any one element, node, or a service. By definition, what you're doing is you're authenticating and authorizing every single service, every single API, every single app, every single user, every single interaction. So by definition, you are strongly authenticating and authorizing anything happening in your environment. So that, to me, I think it boils down to these core three principles. And that's how I like to define zero trust from my perspective. So that's that. I think the other piece to think through, just as I mentioned, as we see, and this is a pretty common pattern across all of our customers, across the geography of how they are transitioning from on-prem to the cloud, this notion of trust and how the perimeter-based security has defined certain security construct around they tend to make like binary distinctions. Like even if you see terms like public and private network, for example, that's a binary distinction. Anything in public is untrusted and bad. Anything in private is trusted and good. And as you start moving to the cloud, those notions destroy very, very quickly, because anything you do in the cloud, you can make one API call and make everything public. So by definition, some of these constructs of security, authentication, authorizations, they don't scale up with the cloud. And that's the biggest change that is happening in the industry and impacting the customers as they think about security in cloud.
Yeah, nice. Plenty to unpack there. I'd just like to maybe hone in on one little thing there, where you sort of mentioned authentication and authorization. There, it sounds to me like the concept of identity is really at the core of zero trust when we talk about it. And that's something that most people have a pretty good understanding of, you know, like for me, like, you know, I've got a driver's license, I've got a passport, you know, whenever I want to do something with the government or the bank, I kind of need to prove who I am. But you kind of seem to extend that out there and talk about machines and services and applications. Could you talk us a little bit through identity in that perspective?
Absolutely. So I'll go back in my sharing mode again. So I think most people understand the human identity concept. It's you have an identity. Even most companies that operate infrastructure internally, you have this notion of I'm Grant, I have an identity, there are certain things, this is how I will get authenticated. The identity access management providers have been trying to solve this problem for a while, which is how do I authenticate you? What kind is it? Multi-factor? Is it single factor? Is it username, password? That model is well understood and has been followed for many, many years. What's new and changing with the cloud is this concept of the machine identity. And what that means basically is this box on the left. What that means is, how do you authenticate an app, whether it's an application or a service or an API or some service construct that you have in the cloud. And it starts breaking down into like few different constructs and why it's important. Because in cloud, when you have applications and services moving to both trusted and untrusted environments, talking to each other, scaling up and down, not controlled in a physical perimeter, how do you make sure and authenticate every single application or API or service? And that's where machine identity come in. Many years ago, we solved this problem with Vault, and the core problem, what we were trying to provide there was every API, every machine, every application should have a strong notion of identity similar to a user. And the way we did that was having some crypto properties and having some policies and workflows attached to what do you actually do with that identity? How do you use that identity? How is it impacts the life cycle? And identity might change depending on the application or service or the underlying capability that that provider provides. But that machine identity is the core concept, which is the root of trust sometimes in how you think about security in the cloud first world. So there's the human identity and there's this machine identity, and both of these constructs and workflows work together. And what you see in like actual practical implementation is these derive certain use cases. Like the machine identity provides, like, how do you do identity brokering? How do you do authorization and policy enforcement and data protection and secrets management? Those are just sub use cases of the same machine identity construct.
Yeah, right. I mean, I find this whole area actually pretty interesting. You know, we look at, if you look at AWS or Google, Azure, Kubernetes, even, I guess, even like GitLab, they all have this strong identity of strong identity service. And so you can basically say, hey, regardless of whether I'm running, you know, Lambda functions or GitLab is triggering a CI pipeline, it has, like, each run has a unique identity. And so you end up with this ability to perform attestation regarding, you know, everything that's accessed and that really sort of strong audit trail. Like when you're evaluating and looking at software, you know, as our CISO, does attestation and, you know, visibility, traceability factor into what you're looking at for Zero Trust?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think the way I think about this is, again, there are some technological problems and then there are some core workflow problems. And me as a buyer, what I don't want to do is pick a solution or a technology that solves this problem for one set of providers or cloud, whether it's cloud, whether it's certain set of technologies or whatnot. If you take a step back, how you provision identity, how do you manage the life cycle, how do you rotate secrets, how do you glue these things together? The workflow piece is pretty common. How do you give identities? How do you define authorization rules? How do you define policies? How do you define those policies along with the workflows? How do you bring the life cycle of your users and the associated authorization rules that they might have? And what I don't want to do is do this specifically for AWS, specifically for Azure, specifically for GCP, or the 100 different platforms I might have in my environment. I want to do it in a uniform, consistent way that can scale across all of my environments. So I can manage the workflow problems easier and not worry about like specific technology, specific integrations and issues. So that's like me as a buyer, that makes my life easier if there are vendors who can do and solve for the core workflow problems, while also optimizing for like technology integrations.
Yeah, nice. That's great. Yeah, so just a reminder there, everybody, if you've got questions you want to ask Talha, you can certainly ask me questions too, but make the most of Talha's time here. Please just throw them into the chat and we'll weave these into the conversation.
By the way, my view is very, very neutral. I run, manage, operate HashiCorp tools, but I also buy plenty of other tools and vendors, and happy to give perspective on both cloud security as well as corporate side of security.
Yeah, great. So just going to shift gears a little bit here, Talha. So Peter King, who's the CEO of Westpac, he was recently in one of our local newspapers called, funnily enough, The Australian. And the quote that I've kind of cherry picked out of there, he said, cyber has to be up at the top of everybody's business and frankly, every consumer's mindset at the moment. The potential for very sophisticated attacks has gone up. So we have to operate at both a coordinated national level as well as an individual level. Where I kind of wanted to go with this, I think there's two really interesting things there, which is definitely we have seen that sophisticated attacks have gone up, but it also feels like we're seeing some, I guess, maybe poor hygiene or just, lax things that lead to really bad exposures. And one that's been really well publicized and discussed, so it's okay to raise here, I think, is what happened with Capital One and, the case of the IAM credentials that were discovered basically off a misconfigured WAF. So I just wanted to get, again, your sort of position on these. And as a CISO, when you're looking at this, how do you balance, that control, good security hygiene, as well as the concept of, these increasingly sophisticated attacks?
Right. Great question. Lots to unpeel here. I think I'll start unpeeling and also point the audience to some fun resources too. The Verizon's data breach investigation report is the one that I like reading annually quite a bit. It's vendor neutral, it's very data driven. And the number one cause of cloud incidents in the last 2-3 years have been cloud misconfigurations. Anytime you see these massive data leaks, it's a misconfigured S3 bucket. The Capital One breach, various reasons, but one of them was a misconfiguration of the AWS environment as well. So if you start looking at the personas that interact with run, manage, operate of cloud, you have the DevOps in the operator persona, which is configuring the cloud, designing the infrastructure, building and running your environments. And then you have the security persona who's interested and responsible for security, hygiene, and compliance monitoring. And the way I think about the balance is more of guardrails than gates, because your DevOps teams, your practitioner, your with cloud, a lot of your notions of how your product delivery and infrastructure operations work changes quite a bit, because infrastructure is now run as code and managed as code and deployed as code, and that changes 50 times a day. In some companies, hundreds of times a day, and a lot of those are like just automated. And you want to make sure your policies and controls and checks and balances meet your requirements, but also allow your organization to operate safely at the velocity that it wants to operate under. The way I think about this is, again, some of the constructs we use using our own tools is putting policies as code as a good example, where yes, your practitioner and the developer and the operator can design the infrastructure as they wish to meet the business requirements, but the security operator can start putting in policies as code in the same way, where they're not coming after the fact and trying to secure something which is insecure or not designed properly. So trying to bring security persona close to the DevOps persona, which is how some of our tools tend to solve this problem too, like Sentinel is an overlay policy engine on top of Terraform or Vault or Nomad Console, whatever you're using. And that bridges this gap of how do you design safely by default? How do you build in policies as you are designing infrastructure and not trying to secure something after the fact? So that's something we, as a philosophy, we tend to use internally as well.
Yeah, nice. I like that. So really, you're embedding it as opposed to bolting on. Yeah, great. I think, Ilch, we've got a question popping up in Q&A.
Yeah, we sure do. Angeli's asking, I'm new in learning Zero Trust. Usually, where does the whole Zero Trust implementation start? In what area? Where's what basically is the best step, the first step in doing this? It's obviously pretty broad. What are your recommendations on the first things?
Wonderful question, and a great question too. I think from my perspective, it starts with identity. It starts with you defining the core construct of identity in your environment. What does that mean in your company, both human identity, machine identity, authentication, authorization of how your services interact with each other, how your users interact with each other. So it starts with definition of identity and rolling out those auth N and auth Z constructs across all of your infrastructure. That's typically where it starts and where I recommend starting. What you'll start seeing challenges, especially with the philosophies and vendors that tend to operate it in some other construct, like start with your device or start with your application or start with my tool, for example. You will quickly start hitting some interesting limitations. Like I'll give you a practical example. The zero trust is not one thing. There are a few parallel philosophies in the industry. Like one of them is the software-defined firewall. One of them is software-defined networking. They have similarities in how you approach certain constructs, but what a lot of these philosophies are trying to do is they're trying to see like, hey, this is how you used to manage your infrastructure and your firewall rules and your IP addresses. And they're trying to force the same philosophies and same constructs in the cloud first world. And some of those philosophies don't really work well because your cloud is ephemeral, it's elastic, it's immutable, it's scaling up and down. And networking is hard as is to do it in your data center with trying to figure out how to segment and how to put firewall rules and how to keep them up to date with the changing notion of your application infrastructure. When you actually start pushing this in cloud, it starts becoming like even more complicated. Somebody just mentioned Beyond Corp. Beyond Corp is actually a similar construct of zero trust that we are pushing as well, which is, again, if you look at what Beyond Corp is also doing, it's also using the same construct of your perimeter is gone. There is no perimeter. With cloud, your notion of perimeter is broken. Your application sitting in the private data center is talking to applications sitting in cloud with proxies in between. Your users, especially in the remote first world, are everywhere. Your customers are interacting with your services all over the globe. So there is no, like your most of your network security has to change because you should assume every network is untrusted, whether it's your private network or your public network. There are companies and plenty of entities which are mostly, Beyond Corp is just a marketing term Google uses, but underlying concepts are the same. If you look at the Beyond Corp white paper as well, it is mentioning the same philosophies of authenticating users, authenticating your endpoints, attaching policies of those users with the assets that they have access to, whether those are data assets, information assets, applications, or a set of services, and try to automate all of these authentication and authorization checks.
And that's a great response, Talha. And I think yeah, you've set the context there great, right? Which is about the total breadth. And just to echo some sentiments there as well, you know, a lot of the customers that we talk to, our focus when it comes to zero trust is very much, you know, that application space and what we're doing there. I do think a lot of, you know, people are looking as well at sort of, you know, end users, devices, and how they roll sort of, you know, what they trust users to do on, you know, bringing their own device and et cetera. Now that's clearly not something that, you know, we have any kind of product or play for, Talha, but is that as well, you know, part of your philosophy when you're looking at this, and something you'd recommend that people look at as part of their approach?
Absolutely. And this is a vendor neutral comment. The principles still apply the same. To give a practical example, credential compromise is a pretty big issue that every company tends to deal with. Username and password, even if you do multi-factor authentication, it's like Talha has an identity, I have access to, let's say, my CRM. If somebody compromised my credentials and they logged in as Talha, it's like, yep, the username password match, I can grant them access. But if you go back in this construct of what I was mentioning, the identity of the user as well as identity of the machine, that's a zero trust concept in the corp world where you're authenticating your corporate assets pretty much a similar way as you are authenticating your cloud assets as well. And You basically marry your user identity along with your machine identity and say, yep, user Talha is associated with this device. I understand the identity of this device. It's a cryptographic identity, whether it's a certificate or a serial number or some policy attached to that. It's what you're using to strongly authenticate the user as well as the device they're coming from. And then you can make your policy rules like, yep, I will allow if you access this application from this device, or I will not allow you access this application from this device. And you can put your users and policies in different buckets like, yep, your external customers can interact with this service anywhere on planet. But my internal admin user, which has privileged roles, has to come from a device that I trust and has certain policies like hard drive encryption and anti-malware and a patch browser, for example.
Yeah, nice. Anjali's got a hand up, I see as well. Maybe if you've got a question, Anjali, or if anyone else has a question, just do drop it into the Q&A, or you may have just misclicked the raise hand button there. So Talha, I wanted to circle back again to the previous response, because you kind of alluded a couple of times to the fact that the perimeter is no longer really, I don't know, hard and fast, I guess. Trying to find a way to say it politely, like we can't put all of our faith in the perimeter. And you've alluded to it a couple of times. Can you just explain a little bit more about why that's changed? And you've kind of spoken about how to handle and respond to it, but if you could maybe lend a bit more nuance to that, that'd be great.
Yeah, good. So I think the way, and this is how I see transition happening, is companies that are on-prem, they are migrating to cloud. The migration to cloud is not a binary journey. It's not like one day suddenly everything from on-prem is now in the cloud. It goes through some transitions. Maybe you start with 5% of stuff on cloud, then 10%, then 50, 20, and maybe one day you're 100% on the cloud, but that's a transition journey. What happens in this transition is your existing perimeter and network security model was built on this notion of firewalls and network boundaries and segments and the binary distinction between what's trusted and non-trusted. As soon as you put your private data center and link it to the cloud, whether it's through a VPN or a transit gateway or a direct link or direct connect, what have you, you basically have your internal network now talking to cloud, even though they may be a logical network and instance of your cloud. The core constructs of cloud and the security and identity and policy network are so different than what you're used to. So your firewall rule, go to like trying to keep up with the firewall changes in cloud, for example, or your IP addressing scheme, or your policy to allow one application to talk to another. So this whole IP address based security, whether it's through firewall or through your intrusion detection system or any conventional network middleware, that just doesn't work, because a user that has an IAM role can open up your Redshift or S3 or your data store to talk publicly. So you have to very quickly think about a very different kind of a security model that only applies to cloud, that doesn't work with the existing network security model that you've been working through.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So there's like the transition, right, where IP used to be what we considered identity because it was pretty fixed and static. And I guess that's, you know, we can't assume that with things like auto scaling groups or Kubernetes and the way that things scale there. Yeah, that's great. I mean, to sort of extend on this idea, and I get this question a lot actually from customers, so I'd love to get your take on it as well, which is largely around, I guess, security concerns when it comes to the public cloud, you know, and they just sort of say, look, are these changes and are the trade-offs that we get about being able to, you know, move faster and get the agility and the programmable constructs in public cloud, you know, is this worth the payoff around the lack of control? Or sometimes they phrase it differently, like, you know, is public cloud inherently less secure than operating within our own data center? And if so, what can we do to protect ourselves?
Good question. And this is not a binary yes or no answer. I think the way to unpeel this is every company on planet really good at running, managing, operating their infrastructure? I think we all know the answer is no. So with public cloud, what you are inheriting with these large cloud providers is they're taking responsibility for run, manage, operate certain layers, like the physical data center, the operating system, the virtual machines, the networking, the physical security of those services. And what they're saying is, hey, let me abstract maybe 7 out of 13 layers you're worried about. I will take responsibility of those layers, so you don't have to worry about building your data centers. You don't have to worry about networking gear or routers and switches and cameras and some security about the layer, which they communicate as a shared responsibility model. And what they're saying is, all right, you can worry about your business logic and your applications and the infrastructure you want to manage. So in some cases, what's happening is, it's not like more or less security, it's you are pushing down security responsibility of certain pieces of stack to a more mature entity, which is incentivized to do it well across everybody. If Amazon didn't do security right, nobody would go to Amazon. If Microsoft didn't do security right, nobody would go to Microsoft. So it's understanding that boundary and layer of what are you responsible for from security perspective, and what is the underlying provider providing you in terms of security services. So that's, I think, one piece to understand. And there are obviously huge benefits of public cloud and large entities providing that service, because now everybody doesn't have to manage the data center security, for example. But what's changed with cloud is now this shared responsibility model of consumers of this clouds trying to understand how to secure their workloads and what are the pieces they are responsible for: patching, application management, configuring, deployment, identity, security, data protection. All of these things are still your responsibility. So if you spin up insecure infrastructure, you will have security problems. If you manage secure infrastructure, you still have certain responsibility that you have to manage. So I think the public cloud movement has eliminated a class of security problems, introduced a new set of security problems for the modern world. And what you'll see, as before in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, a lot of attacks used to be at the operating system level and the network level. Those attacks have shifted to be more around cloud misconfigurations and applications and going after the data. So attacks have evolved, risks have evolved. Conducting security and understanding of the security and the cost of attacks have also decreased to some extent. So the world has moved and evolved. But that's the long answer to your short question.
That's great. Honestly, I think short questions tend to be pretty trite rather than something that's actually applicable and that we can learn from. I mean, I guess the thing I'd love to add to that as well is, even though there is that shared responsibility model and, these hyperscalers have teams who are large enough that they can really hyper specialize on this stuff, ultimately you can't outsource the risk, right? So while you can outsource the responsibility, you still have to own the risk. I think that's something that people tend to struggle with a bit. Ilch, I think I got a note from you. We've got another question coming in.
Yeah, look, Jared's got a question. For a company that's transitioning some workloads to the cloud and has both Windows and Linux services, how would you recommend to go about identity and securing service-to-service connections?
Great question.
There, but
yeah, let me piggyback here back to my original diagram of the user identities that most people are familiar with and the machine identity. If you look at these two boxes on the left, one of them talks about this concept of your applications and services as they come to the cloud. Doesn't matter which platform they're hosted on, whether it's Windows or Linux or Mac or what have you. You have your certain services need to talk to certain services, and you want to make sure that model is well defined and you have some good sense of security there. So practical example, let's say you have an identity billing service and an account service and an analytics service, pretty common services that people tend to build in cloud. how does my user login service interact with the billing service, for example? So you start putting in, as you're migrating to the cloud, you have these applications and services, which are like a higher level abstraction concept of microservices architecture, or whatever philosophical model you want to follow. But that's how typically your application services start getting decomposed in terms of services, which is a higher level abstraction concept. The next thing you start getting into is which service needs to talk to whom. So let's say you say, okay, my billing service is not external facing. Only 3 internal services need to talk to my billing service. You'll typically do what is called like machine-to-machine access and authorization, which is whichever product you use, you'll come up with an identity. You'll provide a cryptographic identity like a certificate. That identity will have some policy attached to it around this application from access control is only allowed to talk to this service and that service. And that policy framework we use, Console, is a product that we have that solves the service discovery machine-to-machine access authorization problem in the cloud. And it's the same concept of when you're moving from this IP-based world to a cloud world, regardless of how you define your services, each service needs to have an identity, a policy, a service construct that you only want to use to scale this up. So the 2 boxes in the middle that you see, which is a use case and workflow, pretty much everyone starts experiencing from user and machine identity is, how do my machine app or application X talk to machine and application Y? And how do my human on the right need to interact and get access? And how do I authorize those actions? And the whole policy framework, how do I think about solving that problem?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Talha. So I think it looks like we've got a follow-up.
Quick follow one, yeah. So
yeah.
Talha, thanks. I was going to say, for Console Connect specifically, how are we going to be able to see more supported proxies? Maybe one for Grant.
Oh boy, that's a product question. I'll give you my sense, and obviously some product specific webinar can talk about this in more detail. But the Connect-Aware proxy service, what they're basically allowing you to do is just enable unmodified applications to use Connect. There are some integrations that we support out of the box. Our core philosophy is we work on solving like the core workflow problems, regardless of the underlying proxy itself. So Console ships with Envoy as a default proxy. There are plenty of other proxies that we support today. I think some of it is like an ecosystem, what the ecosystem is driving and what the market demands, and we take that into account. Some of it is what we consider to be like a core workflow problem that should be part of the core Console and Console Connect. What is what we rely on, like the third-party layer 7 application or network proxy services to provide. It's definitely constantly evolving. We're constantly investing in the ecosystem, both the partner ecosystem and the ISV ecosystem around it.
Yeah, there's a ton definitely we could go into there, right? I think, and I know we've got Pete on the call. Pete tends to coordinate a lot of our marketing events, and maybe we can get something together there, Pete, that deals a bit more detail with how we leverage Console to tackle some of these challenges regarding service-to-service communication. So, great question, thank you. So one thing, you touched on a thing there really quickly, Talha, regarding the idea of using what was effectively mutual TLS as a means for, I guess, confirming identity, on both sides, hence mutual TLS. Now, that tends to require you to have, a pretty mature model when it comes to things like certificate rotation. What do you see as the risks around people, potentially getting their hands on, public-private keys, being able to impersonate services, et cetera? Like, how do we tackle that? Maybe could be a good question.
Oh boy. So two-part answer. I think one of them is yes. I mean, running a PKI operation at scale is not easy, and not everybody has that sophistication to do it, right? Which is one of our philosophies as we build our products is try to make that workflow easier. Like when you deploy console, it comes up with a PKI construct by default. You don't have to worry about. You have to just worry about like 3 or 4 basic things, and we allow the flexibility for you to tweak this in your environment, and you can bring in your own PKI and your own CA authority in the mix. But the whole workflow of generating the cert, attaching the cert, that workflow is very optimized part of the core offering to make practitioners' life easy, so they don't have to worry about like doing all of this workflow in life cycle. For us, I can talk about like the practical run, manage, operate of like some PKI services we do. There are a few different things we do. One is an internal PKI for our internal services. One is the external set of services that we trust. There are a few things we do. One is there are a lot of parallel initiatives that get attached to your PKI. One of the, how do you do domain management and services management, and DNS, and the root certificates that you trust and the intermediate certificates you trust. So the few things we've done well is all of our DNS actually is also as code. We use Terraform to do DNS and domain management. The benefits and really good security properties we get there is every DNS change is auditable, is managed centrally. We can enforce some naming schemes and subdomain and domain patterns, and put things like, all right, any external service has to follow this naming convention, this type of a construct. And we can also limit, for example, which root CAs do we trust, for example, and what does our PKI look like, and how will we sign and rotate these certificates, and what are the policies attached to it. So we can automate all of those things and just worry about the checks and balances we care about. So there are plenty of fun things that we've done around putting all the DNS as code, all the certificates management, and the lifecycle policies as code around this.
Unreal. So I'm going to change gears a little bit here. I'm just looking, we've got sort of 15 minutes left, and I'm not sure if everybody on the call is aware, but we now within HashiCorp have 3 of our products running as SaaS offerings, being Terraform, Consul, and Vault. And one of the things that I kind of think of when we look at Zero Trust and potentially gets overlooked is kind of the people and process. So we've spoken now pretty heavily about machine to machine, and I'm just thinking we've got SREs who are managing these services, and I'm pretty certain that they don't just get to SSH into core services and muck around. So when we start looking at that human to machine authentication, authorization, permitted actions, not just the technology side, right? But what does that look like, technology and process, if that's okay?
Oh, wow. So I can talk a little bit about how we run operations. I think it goes back to the same, not talking about technology of any of our products here, but it starts with the same trust principle of who is authenticated and authorized to perform certain actions. So by default, nobody actually gets production access. The way we automate this is, just to give you people a sense of scale, like we're running close to like 4,000 accounts, multi-cloud. And a lot of the automation from process perspective that we've done is we've delegated down the access control responsibility to respective teams. So what security has done is we've defined some policies and constructs of like, these are the controls we expect in every team, but not managing the every single approval in the company of like who gets access to what. The way this process is scaling for us is, let's say an SRE team needs production access to a particular product and service. We put these teams in groups, and those groups have some baseline access policies attached to those groups. And by definition, those permissions are right-sized. So, but to give a practical example, let's say the Terraform Cloud team needs access to production. They are part of a group. That group has certain policies attached to it. They can only perform certain actions. When they go and they do want to perform some privileged actions, they go through that workflow and process, which is auditable, has SODs, as well as some of these identities on production, they're generated on the fly. So we are reducing risk of, like, you don't get blanket production access on machines forever. You are going through this process. You just get a one-time, just-in-time token. Your access is authorized. It's audited and logged. We can do session recording and things of those nature. That way we have like very strong notion of identity, but also meet our compliance requirements. So the process is a little bit like more elastic and scalable, where we define the policies and controls, some manuals, some in code. But that's how the process works internally.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm certainly glad that I don't have the responsibility for managing that. I mean, it sounds hugely complex, and clearly our customers put a lot of trust in us to not mismanage that.
Yeah, I think also just to clarify a bit more, like in terms of like the need of automation, is just to give you a sense of, again, how we are thinking about certain things, is a lot of this infrastructure is ephemeral too. Like from risk perspective, there is some services which are like higher risk. But to give you a practical example, like the Terraform run plan operation, for example, when we run these operations, they are actually run in a very controlled, isolated environment. After that operation is run, that virtual machine is actually destroyed. So the way we think about like even abuse management and policies attached to it, that's some fun security and risk management we've done. When we'll be writing some blog posts how to describe some of these constructs as well, but most of them is just using our own tools of Vault, creating the identity, Sentinel enforcing the policies, Boundary providing the notion of the human to machine access in a privileged access manner.
Right. It's always nice to hear that we're dog fooding our own products in production. It's always good to hear. So look, we're coming up with 10 minutes left. We'll see if we get any other questions, but I've clearly we've seen so much going on of late in the press regarding different security incidents or incidences, whether it's self-hosted, Microsoft Exchange servers that have vulnerabilities, kind of also controversially, US state services being able to then come in and try and remediate compromised servers without any authorization from the companies in play. We've seen supply chain attacks. There's a lot going on. So what's probably, I'm just really curious if you had to, and it's kind of an unfair question, but like, what is the one thing that keeps you up at night? What's the one thing that you're most concerned about from a security perspective there?
Oh, so that's an easy answer. My number one focus is protecting us and protecting our customers. So we are taking responsibility of providing infrastructure services and security products to the world, whether you are an open source customer or an enterprise customer or a cloud customer, it doesn't matter. We take our security responsibility seriously. So our number one and 100% focus is protecting our products and our infrastructure to serve our customers. Obviously, it influences the program, and there are various things we do, protecting ourselves from all sorts of threat actors, including criminals and hobbyists and researchers and whatnot. We're running a pretty open, transparent culture as well as a security program. You'll see all sorts of disclosures and activities and publications we make around this topic. So that part is an easier answer, obviously harder to implement, but also a ton of fun.
Yeah, cool. And just, I mean, since we're kind of on this topic, Talha, is there somewhere central attendees could go if they want to see like security advisories from us?
Yeah, so we have a security page, hashicorp.com/security. That's the landing page you should go to. It catalogs high level what our security program is. the assurances that we provide, the commercial attestations that we have, also indexes our security white papers, and also has a link to the Discuss portal, which is the community we run. It also has a big security section, transparently publishes all of our advisory security patches, as well as guidance for our customers, not just for security, but also other products.
Great. It's probably worth mentioning there too, if the customers out there work with their account executives with NDAs in place, we can share some additional information, a bit of under the covers, if you like.
Yeah, good point, Ilch. So one last question from me, Talha, and I kind of want to just come full circle back to the beginning. We spoke about, your definition of zero trust, and we even had a question about, implementation details. Oh, here we go. We've got a question from Nigel as well. In fact, we might field this before I throw that, if that's all right, Ilch.
Yeah. You want me to read it out? We're ready to go. So look, Nigel's asking, if identity is the foundation of zero trust, is it time to ditch user passwords in favor of solutions like FIDO?
Yeah, I think good question. I think identity takes different shapes and forms depending on the application or the vendor or the infrastructure you're interacting with. Credentials is one type of an auth method, biometrics is another, FIDO, USB, all of these are like auth methods that that are available. It's up to you as a customer and consumer and implementer and operator what you can implement and support. I think the practical reality of like running any large company is you tend to start, there's two different sides. One is what you are implementing for your customers. Obviously, we want to push most modern security practices and auth methods, but we support any auth method, whether there are legacy applications that need username and passwords, whether they need or the auth method comes from an IDP like Okta and SAML and things of those nature, or you want to support modern constructs like FIDO or WebAuthn. So we support all of them. We understand the predominance of all sorts of applications, from mainframes to conventional infrastructure to modern cloud infrastructure. Will the world go passwordless? I hope. The practical reality is it won't anytime soon, just because of all of these legacy applications and infrastructure that will exist and continue to exist for some time.
That's an interesting one too, right? Because I think at the moment, we tend to do a lot of augmentation with physical keys. And I clearly haven't been as deep in the security game as you have, Talha, but I'd always remember the something something you have, something you are kind of model, and I just worry about passwordless. It's like it's great and it's more secure in terms of people not writing down passwords, forgetting them, and so on. But are you shifting like the requirement for personal security or, even operational security then to the end user to make sure they're not leaving a YubiKey lying around on their desk that someone else can grab in order to impersonate them? And I think that I think we're still fairly early in that evolution of how do we handle that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this goes to for folks who are in the audience who are designing applications. The human piece is super important. The design and the philosophy and the psychology of how humans operate. There is a reason people forget passwords. It's human mind. There is a reason people reuse passwords. It's human psychology. We are lazy. We cannot remember 500 passwords. Along came password managers to solve that problem for us. So I think as you're designing application infrastructure and keep the human experience and design philosophies in mind.
That's sweet. Okay, so just to pick up on that last question, we've got 3 minutes left. Thank you everyone so much for your attentiveness today. Zero trust, again, is zero trust something you can implement, Talha? Is it something, we've got a kind of core principle. One of our core design principles here is pragmatism. So just asking the question straight out, is zero trust a thing that people are able to implement?
You can, but understand it's not a magic wand, not a binary thing that will achieve some state of nirvana for you. It's good security principles in the modern world that you can piecemeal break down and start implementing, starting with good authentication and authorization of your users, strong identity of your applications and services, modern security crypto practices for data protection type constructs. So you can absolutely, but outside marketing buzzwords, good security design principles that you can apply in your environment, absolutely.
It's great. All right, look, sounds like Grant's shut down, but look, I think we're at time. So look, thanks for those great insights today, Grant and Talha. Some great questions from the audience as well. So thanks for everyone participating. Look, I think if I can paraphrase, we sort of walked across what zero trust was, really a new way to operate. What I got from all of that was don't trust anything. We covered the challenges that come with starting to consume and that changing world of cloud operations, understanding where our business responsibility stops and when the obligations of our CSPs. We also looked into how we can start off, right? Like, it's important to define identity, your authentication mechanisms and interactions as a first step to identifying the risks and the quick wins. We also covered some multi-cloud security. How do we work out how to connect services to services? And we understood that console can help there. And you will need to define your machine-to-machine authorization and identities as a first step, and then identifying the way that can be policed and defining your service constructs. And ultimately, you need to own the risk, right? And our world is blended, connecting things that you can to start the journey and close those doors on the obvious risks. And finally, we also looked at how Vault and Terraform can simplify certificate rotation, help you with identity lifecycle and DNS management that will help you with the fundamentals for not only defining your identity, but the service-to-service communication. I certainly found that very enjoyable. We're coming at the top of the hour. So if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to sort of close this off. If you do have further questions, you can reach Grant on Twitter at Grant Orchard and Talha at tt@hashicorp.com. I will pop those in, Grant, if you can pop those into the chat so people can copy those. Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our session today. We hope you found it useful. As I mentioned earlier, this session was recorded and we'll send you all an email soon with the link to the recording so you can go back to those sections that you found useful. And if you like what you heard today and want to learn more about HashiCorp's approach to zero trust, I encourage you to check out our zero trust website. So we have a microsite, it's hashicorp.com/solution/zero-trust-security. Thanks again for taking the time to join us today. A big thank you to our speakers, Grant Orchard and Talha Tariq. Enjoy the rest of your day and bye for now.